just so delighted to welcome everybody this evening to Stopping Public School Privatization, a conversation between Diane Ravitch and Reverend Charles Foster Johnson. So let me begin by explaining how we're going to run tonight's discussion. We're recording tonight's talk and we're live streaming it on Facebook. If everything goes smoothly, we'll send out links that you can share with your own networks. And of course, we'll be sharing them on social media platforms as well. Now, you're going to notice that everyone is muted. This allows us to focus on the discussion between Diane and Charles without any interruption. We won't be sharing video either. We'll just be leaving up the screen you see now. So don't think that you're missing out on something that everybody else can see. Charles and Diane's discussion will go on until about 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time, at which time they're going to take questions from you. If you would like to ask them a question, feel free to submit it at any time through the chat feature. MP Communications Director Darcy Cimarusti will be monitoring the chat to field your questions tonight. Meanwhile, MP Grassroots Liaison Marla Kilfoyle is with us tonight too, and she will be asking Diane and Charles as many of the questions you've submitted as possible until we end at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So now that we know how tonight will run, let's get started. For those of you who don't know her, and I can't imagine that anyone does not, Diane Ravitch is the president and co-founder of the Network for Public Education. She is an historian of education and research professor of education at New York University. Diane's blogs at dianeravitch.net, and her blog is close to surpassing 36 million hits. She has written 11 books, including her latest book, Slaying Goliath, and edited another 14. She is a graduate of the Houston Public Schools, Wellesley College, Columbia University, where she received a PhD in History of American Education. Charles Foster Johnson, whom I'm sure you all know as well, is both a pastor and public education advocate. He deeply believes his work as an advocate and supporter of public education is part of his ministry. He is founder and pastor of Bread, a faith community in Fort Worth, Texas. Throughout his 40-year pastoral ministry, he has served churches in Mississippi, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Texas. In 2013, he founded Pastors for Texas Children, a statewide ecumenical organization mobilizing the faith community for public education and advocacy. Pastors for Texas Children now has over 2,500 faith partners throughout Texas. The national organization, Pastors for Children, now has networks in 8 states, and Charles has been instrumental in starting every one of them. So now, without further ado, I'd like to open up the discussion, and Diane, why don't you begin that by talking with Charles and asking him a question about his work.
Okay, I'll be glad to do that. I want to say good evening to everybody and thank you for joining the conversation, and also to thank Carol and Darcy and Marla for making this possible. I can't think of anyone I'd rather talk to right now than Charlie Johnson, who is a great friend, and I feel very fortunate to have met him in the work that we share, which is to help save public education from the privatization forces that have been pushing against it, not only in Texas, but all across the country. Charlie has been not only a good friend, but he's been an incredible advocate for public schools. And he is one of the, I would say, most prominent voices in standing up for a principle that we all hold dear, which is the separation of church and state. And he, as a pastor, has the, I think, the unusual credibility to make the argument that religious liberty is rooted in separation of church and state. And that our founding fathers understood this as well. And so I would say he has a direct connection to them as well. As you heard, I'm a graduate of the Houston Public Schools. I've been back to Texas many times over the past dozen years. And there's a part of me that will always be Texan. Every once in a while, if I have a little bit too much to drink, I'll start sounding like a Texan. I'll start saying I instead of I, and other things like that. But I'm really happy to have you here, Charlie. Thank you for joining us.
Diane, thank you.
I wanted to ask you if you could just give us, I know that we're all in pause mode right now because of this terrible pandemic, but if you could just bring us up to date on where matters stand today in Texas in terms of, first of all, the budget, which, as I recall, in 2011, the legislature, in its lack of wisdom, cut the budget by $5 billion and never fully restored that $5 billion cut. But also tell us about the work that you've been doing to stop vouchers, and then we'll get to charters later.
Sure, it's good to join you, Diane, and thank all of you at Network for Public Education for inviting me to be on this conversation. What a great group. Carol, you and Diane and Darcy and Marla and all of you have just done a phenomenal job of bringing us all together. We're going to talk about that hopefully a little later on too, because I think that collaboration and solidarity is a very important factor in stopping privatization. Privatization is so called for a reason. They believe in sort of the private individual, not connected in community. So I'm glad to be in this conversation. Diane, we'll pick up there because that's where Pastors for Children got started in 2011, as you correctly note. I don't know how you keep up with all 50 states and all these developments, but you do brilliantly. $5.4 billion were cut, and they were devastating cuts. The conventional legislative wisdom was that we were broke here in Texas, and they perpetuated that lie. And these austerity measures were put in. Of course, shortly thereafter, we all of a sudden became flush again. We know how that works, don't we, in these state legislatures. But in 2013, only $3.4 billion of those $5.4 billion were restored. Well, some of our leaders were going all over the state saying that almost all, quote unquote, almost all the cuts had been restored. Well, since when has 60% constituted almost all? And so ministers that was really a wake-up call for us. We began to ask, what on earth is going on here? And then about that time, we picked up your book, Reign of Error. A group of us read it, and holy cow. I mean, we were just awakened. We were convicted. And we concluded that there was an insidious kind of concentrated, well-funded attack on our public schools. And so we got together through the Christian Life Commission of the Baptist General Convention of Texas. And I'll say more about the denominational and faith support of public schools also. But we formed Pastors for Texas Children, and it just took off. And here we are coming up on our 7th birthday. We were, fast forward through the good efforts of many, many groups. We certainly cannot by any stretch claim credit for this, but we were able to pass a significant structural funding bill, House Bill 3, in the last legislative session. And
with them around me trying to be on a Zoom work call.
Yeah.
What did you do?
I just unmuted.
And it infused billions of new dollars into our system. So we've been able to sort of have a game changer here in Texas. We have a long way to go. We'll talk about the voucher policy that all of us have been able to stop here in Texas. Goodness, probably at least a half a dozen times there have been significant voucher initiatives in the Texas legislature. So they've been rebuffed every time, and it doesn't look like we're going to have a voucher bill even come up in a serious way. It always comes up like a bad penny, doesn't it? Because the privatizers never give up. Now, charters, that's another issue. So we sort of lay out the the agenda here: funding, testing, vouchers, charters, and we got a long way to go. As I say, Dr. King used to say in his sermons, we ain't what we ought to be, we ain't what we're gonna be, but praise God, we ain't what we used to be. And so we've had some victories and we've made some strides, but we've still have a lot of work yet to do.
Charlie, has the state made up for the 5.4 billion in cuts? I mean, even if they put in another 5.4 billion, that was 2011, and I'm assuming that the cost of everything has gone up since 2011. So it would be more than 5.4 billion that would be needed to make up for the cuts from almost a decade ago.
Well, exactly. And some estimates are that we are some 20 billion behind what we need, Diane. You know this far better than I do. We rank somewhere along about the mid 40s among our 50 states and per pupil spending down here in Texas. So, we need House Bill 3 session after session after session in order to be brought up to speed in adequate funding for our children's education. Like so many states, we have a constitutional provision that that calls for adequacy and equity, general diffusion of knowledge being essential for the preservation of the liberties and rights of the people. The legislature of this state shall make suitable provision for the operation and maintenance of public free schools. Well, despite what our state Supreme Court has ruled year before last, this provision is not suitable. Any public school educator can attest to that. The teacher salaries are below standard. They're certainly not commensurate to what a profession of that stature deserves. In many of our schools, there's inadequate equipment, inadequate facilities. The budgets have been cut in a draconian way. All these enrichment programs that you had in Houston public schools and that I had growing up in Alabama have been cut. Librarians have been cut. Nurses have been cut. Music programs, art programs, band, a lot of athletic programs. So no, we're way behind here. And what some of our leaders are now saying, it's not going to come as any surprise to you. What they're now saying is, well, we've had this House Bill 3 pass, and it was $6.5 billion new dollars. And so we've done what we need to do. Let's move on. When, we're trying to say, hold on, people, hold on. This was a first step. This wasn't the game hadn't been won here. And we need to create a conversation again coming into the 87th legislature. Our legislature meets every other year down here in Texas. Coming into the 87th legislature in 2021 to talk about funding again. Well, the coronavirus hits. Oil has tanked. It's not $50-something a barrel oil anymore. It's $20-something a barrel oil. So we're going to have a real funding issue in Texas, and we're trying to scramble to get a footing on, the educational advocacy community, trying to get a footing on what we will advocate for, what we will push in the upcoming session. And, we're all kind of in a free fall. We don't know.
Charlie, you reminded me by saying the way things were, and I can't help but think about when I went to high school in Houston very many decades ago. I was not in a suburban school. I was not in a special school for, wonderful kids. It was a very ordinary public school right in the heart of Houston. And we had kids from all different economic levels. Now, it was a segregated school because it was the 1950s, but it was economically mixed. And we also had classes for children with special needs, which was quite remarkable for that time. We had a school nurse. We had a fully functional library. We had lots of athletics. We had lots of extracurricular activities. Maybe money was a problem, but I certainly didn't feel that some part of my education was cut off because the money wasn't there. And I guess the question that I have is whether this legislature, like so many others in the Midwest and the South and other parts of the country, have a disconnect between the kids and the legislators, with the kids becoming increasingly non-white and the legislators being overwhelmingly white and upper middle class, lawyers, privileged, and they just don't feel these are their kids. I mean, is that an unfair statement, or what would
No,
you
it's
think?
not unfair. I think it's important to kind of get to the nub of the matter and to keep asking the question, why does this situation exist when we have a legislative mandate to educate our children? We certainly have a moral mandate, and I think NPE wants me to speak to that a little in our conversation tonight. Also, that probably, as you know, Diane, is the bulk of our message as faith leaders from all the traditions. By the way, a great religious tradition, certainly in Texas and in the southern and midwestern states where we're planting our affiliates. It's predominantly Christian, but we also have Jewish rabbis and Muslim clerics who are a part of our organization also. Well, Texas isn't going to go broke anytime soon, y'all. You know, our budget is a $60 billion biennium. We've got plenty of money down here. We have a low, we kind of have a small government mentality. I mean, the Texas mythos is alive and well. It's based on rugged individualism, a small government kind of thinking, and we're facing a crisis now. How are we going to fund our roads? Texas roads, the quality of Texas roads has been legendary through the decades across this great expanse of prairie down here. I remember coming here 30 years ago thinking, holy cow, these are the best highways I've ever driven on in my life. Water is a huge issue in Texas, and we've got a system of reservoirs that took a lot of money to build. Several years ago, Mr. Boone Pickens tried to corner the water market out in West Texas, buy up all the water rights. The courts intervened to say, wait a minute, water's a public trust. You don't own the water. You can't sell the water as a commodity. They had to tell him no. Schools. I mean, we've got to ask ourselves the question, do we believe in these basic human rights, that these provisions are accorded every person by virtue of that person's occupation on the planet? And it's in the interest of the whole public to educate the whole public. And this country came to that conclusion a long time ago. We do have the money, Diane. It's a matter of, will our leaders marshal the political will? It's not going to be easy, and we don't pretend it'll be easy. But will we marshal the political consensus to access new sources of revenue? Now, we're not crazy about sales taxes. A sales tax, as everybody on this call knows, is a regressive tax. It hurts the poor. But there are lots of other ways. Let me give you an example, if I may. I don't want to get too arcane about this. But in high-rise commercial real estate property values in these huge cities, Dallas, Houston, Fort Worth, Austin, El Paso, those values are not assessed properly or fairly. There are tons of loopholes, because the commercial real estate folks have a lot of political power in the legislature, okay? And so we're leaving billions upon billions of dollars on the table each biennium by not properly assessing property tax. The oil and gas industry runs this state. Oil and gas people believe in public education. They're workers come out of public schools. They want good quality people running, those oil wells. Well, they are willing to pay for that provision, but we've got to have political leaders who believe in the public trust, in the common good, in the common weal, a term that you use, which is a great term. We've lost sight of that wonderful principle. And if we had our governor and our lieutenant governor and our legislative leaders giving that kind of speech on the stump, well, we could marshal that political consensus. Who better than preachers to help politicians do that? We're rhetoricians also. And so we want to try to help give them a vision that lifts us out of this, what Tom Oden, a theologian, called the myth of autonomous individualism. Look, we're not alone. There's no such thing as pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps. However much Texans want, to believe that myth, we are bound together in an inescapable thread of destiny, to quote Dr. King again. And, when we come into communities with this kind of message and we get the community leaders together, we have an event that we call a celebration of public education. It's that simple, that direct. And we put 100, 150, 200 community leaders in a fellowship hall, and we serve a simple meal. And for 45 minutes, we herald the benefits of public education. I mean, we've done dozens of those throughout the state. That's how we have gained our have grown our platform. Nobody disagrees. Everybody says amen, a resounding amen. What do you need me to do? And so it's just a matter of reminding people that the school that nurtured, shaped, and taught you is being attacked, is not always going to be there like you have assumed it would be there, and we need you to stand up and speak out.
Now, Charlie, let me ask you about the charter movement, because to me, this is more insidious in a way than vouchers. I mean, vouchers it's out there. We understand that it's all about subsidizing religious schools, and that the voucher will never be enough to really allow kids to go to the schools that rich people go to. There's a fundamental lie in the voucher movement where they say, if rich people can go to religious schools and private schools, so should you. And here's $5,000. Well, rich people are not paying $5,000. They're usually paying 20 or 25 or 30. In New York City, they're paying 50 or 60,000.
Right.
And there's no voucher that's ever going to match that. So that's the fundamental lie. And you have been incredibly effective at blocking vouchers in session after session. But I think charters are more insidious because they claim to be public schools. And the reality is they're not public schools. They are private organizations run by private boards of trustees. They have a self-selected board. They're not elected. They're not accountable to anyone. And they bring in many cases, for-profit operators, so that even though they are theoretically nonprofit, the person operating the school or the chain of charters may be actually for-profit. Texas is now become, I would say, the number one target for charters. Betsy DeVos has just released a lot, millions more for the IDEA charter chain. And I know you and Carol Burris can talk a lot about how lavishly they spend on themselves and how they wanted to hire a private jet, lease a private jet for their executive travel, which is not exactly what school superintendents do. But that got shot down because that was embarrassing. So instead they just travel first class, them and their families on the public dime. But it's not just IDEA, it's also KIPP and other charter chains, and lots of money now heading straight for Texas. And it will put a lot of public schools out of business to have these charters expanding and choosing the students that they want. So I would like to ask you if you have any insight into this as to whether there is any pushback and whether people realize that the charter movement is a direct attack on public education.
You and Carol and the Network for Public Education has really gotten our attention in Pastors for Children about charters. Carol will remember a significant visit that we had together in a coffee shop on Congress Avenue in Austin, Texas, when for well over, for a couple of hours. Carol sort of gave me chapter and verse, a tutorial, a crash course on the problem with charter schools and charter expansion. What you mentioned, Diane, a couple of other things that come to my mind about the sort of inherent corruption of charters. They barge into a neighborhood without invitation, particularly the corporate chain charters, driven by sort of market dynamics and principles, business principles. They'll purchase a big, very visible piece of property on a busy freeway, much like a big box retailer would do. Oftentimes they set up next to a Walmart or one of those huge retail chains. The local superintendent who is struggling to, I'm thinking about a specific situation here in the Fort Worth area. The local superintendent knows nothing about it. There's been no conversation, no collaboration with her at all. She hadn't been brought into any of this. And all of a sudden, she sees billboards put up in her neighborhood. This is a low-income neighborhood where she's struggling to educate her children. She's only in her second year in this superintendency, and she just feels gut punched, to use an indelicate metaphor. Diane, it's wrong. It's wrong. It's insensitive. It's a violation of decency. And what happens is that multiple schools can be planted in multiple cities under the same single charter. Now, these corporate chain charters are saying, but we've got thousands and thousands of kids on a waiting list. Well, here's what we discovered when Dr. Charles Luke, my trusted colleague, co-director of Pastors for Texas Children, got a group of people together, and now a number of great organizations are involved in it, and formed a charter work group to start carefully, slowly researching and formulating policy proposals that are possible to be passed. So we have to sort of, digest this elephant one bite at a time. But one of the things that Dr. Luke has done is made the simple proposal, a modest proposal, y'all. Let's have an accurate waiting list. We don't have tens of thousands of children on this waiting list because the child's being counted 5, 6, 7 times. Goes over to the next charter and signs up on a waiting list, and the next charter and signs up on a waiting list. So here's a simple way that we can solve, and I don't see any reason why we couldn't do this sooner rather than later. We pass a bill that says the local superintendent who serves at the behest of the democratically elected school board, and that's 7 people, determines if, when, and where the charter school is placed. If we were to do that, in other words, the local district has the last say-so about where or if or when the charter school is established, then that would bring charters back under the public school system. And I think, Diane, as you were the first person I heard say this, we recover the original intent of a charter school, which is to be a laboratory and an incubator for innovation and pedagogy and good ideas that are good for kids that we can then import into the public school system. I don't know why we couldn't have that simple policy proposal. And let's just cut out a lot of the, sort of interim, these small little interim stages. But what we have down here in Texas, and God only knows where this came from, and I'm still reeling from it, we have every philanthropist and foundation around supporting charter schools.
Right.
For the life of me, I know some of these foundations support traditional public schools, but every single one of them ought to. And they ought to be lined up at the poorest public school door. We can fix these poor schools. We are in these schools. We see the dedication of the principals and the teachers, and particularly the staff, and particularly right now in the COVID-19 sheltering in place, where these lunchroom workers and cafeteria workers and janitors are just our community and neighborhood heroes, serving children, providing children food security at this time when they wouldn't have anything to eat. We know we can fix those schools, but we don't have the will to fix those schools. If the legislature would simply harness the funding to go turn those schools around, all under the local superintendent and the district control, and get a public-private partnership in restoring the quality of those so-called, those declining schools, those low-performing schools. We don't use the term failed school because there's no such thing as a failed school. But what they're going to learn is what you write about in your blog every day. Look, the principal factor that is determining the low performance of the school has nothing to do with the school, has nothing to do with the teachers, has everything to do with the poverty and of the neighborhood.
Yes.
So we're not, it's crazy making. In pastoral care, we have a term in the field of psychology and counseling, a term called crazy making, where you know the truth, but the lie is so persistent, like an abusive husband who violates and batters his wife, and in the same breath says, but I love you, but I love you, but I love you. No, you don't. And it's the same thing with the philanthropic and foundation community that might talk a good talk about public schools and about the necessity of high quality public education. Well, if you believe that, and these are the richest people in Texas, pick up the phone and call the governor. Leverage your influence to generate this political will to get these policies in place. We don't have to fiddle around here for another decade with all of these little teeny tiny steps. We can bring this back in under public control, public oversight, get rid of the corruption. You mentioned this jet idea. Public charter schools bought a jet. Now they had to turn around and sell it because you and Carol and others made such a racket about it, and the Houston paper picked up on it, put it on the front page of the paper, and everybody's saying, what is this all about? It's a matter of stewardship, Diane.
You've also, Charlie, got all of those Gulen schools in Texas. And one of the times that I visited, I met with a legislator who said, oh, yes, he'd gone to Turkey, and he was part of one of these junkets. And the Gulen organization in Texas was sending legislators, people specifically on the education committee, on all expense paid trips to Turkey, which were quite wonderful. And then they came back as enthusiasts for these Gulen charters. But I think that you mentioned the original idea. The original idea was collaboration and not competition. And what we have today is competition without collaboration. And the competition is a competition for students and a competition for scarce dollars. And I wish that you could somehow get across to the legislators that if they care about public schools, they would not put them into competition so that the system that educates 80 to 90% of the kids loses dollars to these boutique organizations funded by billionaires. It just doesn't make any sense at all. It's like saying, well, we're going to let the big ship go down because we're launching a handful of lifeboats. I'm sorry, that just doesn't work. And as Carol has shown in the work that she's done on the charter schools program, the federal funding, a huge number of charter schools open and close. And when parents say to me, well, what should I do? You know, I always say to them, you make your own decision about what you want to do, but the risk you take when you put your child in a charter school is, first of all, they may not want your child, because if your child has a disability, they will not want them. If they don't read English well, they won't want them. And if they act up in school, they'll kick them out. But the other risk you face is that the charter may accept them and then close its doors with a week's notice or no notice at all in January, and you'll be looking for school in a very inappropriate time when your child has to start all over again. There are a lot of risk in this. And the other issue you raised about the waiting list is one that's particularly annoying to me, because I know how phony it is. The only time I ever saw a waiting list audited, it was done by Boston Public Radio a few years back, and they literally went through the waiting list because the charter schools in Boston had been boasting how many thousands were on the list. And this one reporter went through it, and he found, as you point out, kids who were listed again and again and again because they had applied to multiple charters.
Right.
And in some cases, the kids had already been accepted at a charter or had gone to the charter and left and gone back to public school, but their name was never taken off the list.
Right.
So the list turned out to be a phony. In Los Angeles, where I kept hearing about the waiting list, a board member there who is a strong supporter of public education released the fact that more than 80% of the charter schools in Los Angeles have vacancies. So there may be that 18% have a waiting list, but more than 80% do not have a waiting list. And when you have that many vacant spots, why in the world would you create more charter schools to compete for when there is really not the demand that that these billionaires are claiming there is? I just think that I would love to see you reach, and I don't know how to reach them myself, so I don't know why I'm telling you to do this, but if someone could get through to the people funding these charter schools, that the demand is not there, and that they're drawing from a finite pie. I mean, the pie is not expanding, and in the wake of this pandemic that we're living through, education's likely to take a big financial hit, which will make it even more unconscionable to take money away and give it to charter schools and vouchers.
Diane, you're spot on about that. And as I say, and Carol knows this, that we just have not, we're ministers, we're outliers, we're certainly everybody listening on this call knows more about public education in its granular detail than we do. We are simply trying to come alongside educators in real affirmation and solidarity. But we're beginning a project to build relationships with these funders, with these philanthropists, and patiently, slowly try to convince them that of the ills of privatization and how this state cannot afford two separate educational systems. We're a limited government state. Why do we have this government expansion in duplicating services right and left and wasting all this money? I thought accountability and stewardship was a basic conservative political value, didn't you? Well, now we're wasting money at every turn. Some estimates say that we could save $2 billion a biennium if we brought charter schools back under the public school umbrella. And so we need that conversation with the foundations. It's interesting. You really are hitting on something I think very significant. These foundations love us. Oftentimes they ask for the meeting with us, and we tell them some of the projects that we're doing, particularly in these low performing schools in these poor neighborhoods. We apply for a modest grant. Diane, I'm going to give you a news flash. We, with the exception of one foundation that gave us a grant years ago, we do not get a penny from these foundations. We are a part of coalition with them. Have conversation with them. We know their directors. As I say, they oftentimes sort of, in a whisper, we love what you're doing, what you stand for. But I just think there's a herd mentality. And I have to say something about making commodities out of our children and markets out of our classrooms. I mean, we're indignant about that. And I have people tell me all the time, Reverend, take a breath and, get off your righteous indignation high horse. Well, I'm not going to get off of it. Education is at heart a spiritual enterprise. By that I mean that it is given around the uniqueness of an individual child who is unlike anyone else on the planet. And a teacher brilliantly knows how to find that spark within that child and to build on that sort of core uniqueness of that human being, as Scripture says, who's fearfully and wonderfully made. And so, this is such, we want to sort of, we kind of slap our foreheads when we see these destructive policies, particularly when we know the verbiage of the Constitution, we know what it calls for, and we know that we're out of compliance, that we're breaking the law through voucher policies and charter policies. Well, I thought we were constitutional conservatives. Hadn't you heard that about Texans? So why aren't we abiding by the law? Well, when, Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterian preachers come in, particularly when rural preachers join with urban preachers, that is, we bring the rural Republican alongside the urban Democrat, we have found that we do have a unique voice, and we have a little toehold here that we can build upon. It's going to take several things. It's going to take superintendents holding the line. And Diane, I got to tell you, it's harder and harder and harder for them to do that. And we're very close to the educational leaders, but the money that is thrown around by these philanthropists, I'm hearing more and more superintendents say, Pastor, I agree with you. I know the truth of what you're saying, but we really have to cooperate because these people are just too powerful.
So Charlie, is there any effort to get through to these philanthropists and say two simple things? One, vouchers actually get worse results than public schools. No matter what you want to say about public schools, vouchers get worse results. And we've had study after study that shows that. And charters, the best of them cream and skim the students that they want. And the typical charter gets the same results. And in some states, like in Ohio and in Nevada, the charters are among the worst performing schools in the states. Don't they care about getting the best use of their dollars? This is what makes me tear my hair out, is don't they look at results? Results say this is a waste of money to divert it from the public schools to do something that we have now had 30 years experience. This is not a new idea. So when they talk about the status quo is rich people throwing money at failing charter schools, rich people throwing money at religious schools that have uncertified teachers. And meanwhile, 80 to 90% of our kids are in public schools that are underfunded. So it seems so crystal clear to me that I can't understand why they're willing to waste their money in such a profligate way.
Yeah, I don't have an easy answer to that powerful question. You make such a cogent case in Slaying Goliath that, that we've reached the tipping point and the pendulum is swinging back now, thanks to countless hundreds of thousands of teachers and parents and community leaders, and now pastors are joining them all over the country. There is one thing more powerful than money, and that is a vote. And we have proven, not in an exhaustive way. We have 181 legislators in Texas, 150 House members and 31 Senate members, but we have already proven that we can flip a seat. And when you flip a seat, Diane, it gets everybody's attention. So not only do we stay in your question, how do we go convince these philanthropic leaders and business leaders? And we're working on that. We don't, as I say, we don't have any magic formula. And I think it's a powerful question. And I think we need to spend the next months, maybe this is a good time that we have a little bit of a different schedule for us to give some real thought and mind share to that question. How do we get some billionaires on our side here? I find these people to be people of goodwill. They're not bad people. And oftentimes the same people perpetuating these destructive policies that purport to do education as a business, which is such a lie. And it's a particularly despicable lie to a minister. A minister who serves a modest-sized congregation, well, that congregation is just as important as a mega church congregation. Well, the business thinking would say, well, I guess the mega church is more important because look at all those people, look at the parking lot full, and look at all those millions and millions of dollars. Well, ministers don't. Even the mega church pastor doesn't think like that. Well, most of them don't. There are a few knuckleheads out there that get all the attention and all the headlines, God forbid. But I think we do have to take this message directly to the business establishment. Now, I'm going to give you some good news. Down here in Texas, thankfully, the chambers of commerce are beginning now to embrace traditional public schools. And this is to the point of your book, and you outline it just so powerfully. They're beginning to see the value of public education, how we cannot have voucher schools and charter schools and traditional public schools, particularly when those alternatives don't work. I think we've nipped vouchers in the bud, but now, hey, you know this, Diane, we're going to have every virtual voucher policy in America come up in the next legislative session. Look how great we've done in educating our kids on a computer screen. Well, the last thing our children need is another computer screen. And it's going to be interesting to see the pushback that they get from all these parents who are suddenly, forced into homeschool teaching. And but I think we can, through all these various sectors of society, the business community, the religious community, the philanthropic community, the agricultural community. I had a conversation today. Look, Texas Farm Bureau is huge down here. Farmers, ranchers, cattle people. They need to be lined up behind public schools. Those folks aren't educated in charter schools and in private schools. And so we've got to bring the entire community together. So votes are more important than money. We're blessed to have the support of Charles Butt, who is a wonderful businessman here in Texas who supports traditional public education. And Raise Your Hand Texas is just doing a phenomenal job, particularly in changing the narrative, Diane. And this is a good time for me to say, look, we're ministers, we get credit we don't deserve. And but we've got a lot of great people down here. And the principle of collaboration and solidarity and partnership and coalition building is absolutely essential. If our listeners are in other states, you've got to get administrator groups collaborating with teacher groups, collaborating with business groups, collaborating with religious groups, and bring that coalition together to push back on charters and vouchers. And that's what we have successfully done on vouchers in Texas. And for the
So
reason,
Shirley, I want to
Yeah.
ask you a question. I
Yeah.
want to ask you a question that goes to the heart of your mission. And that is, we're facing a Supreme Court decision that could strip away all of the state constitutional protection against vouchers. I mean, as we both know, and as most people on this call know, about 2/3 of the states have a constitutional provision that says no state funding of religious schools. And many states have simply ignored that provision. Florida, for example, not only has very strong language saying that public money is for public schools, and they have about 4 different voucher programs. They simply ignored it. They've even had a referendum that they against vouchers, and they ignored that too. So but that meager state constitutional provision is probably going to be stripped away by the Supreme Court, and we're all going to have to be on our own. And so I ask you this question: when you speak to your fellow pastors in Oklahoma and other states, what's the basic argument that you make in which you say this, as religious people, as people who deeply care about our mission, we should support public schools and we should not be seeking the public dollar for our own schools?
If I can, this is Carol, if I can just jump in for a second. Charles, if you could give just a short answer to that question, because we have so many people right now who are dying to ask questions. So if you could give a short answer to that question, and then we're going to open up the floor.
sure. Well, Diane, I'm glad you flagged that, because the Espinoza case is before the Supreme Court now, and you are right. It might be, they may rule in favor of Espinoza, and they may sort of invalidate the church-state separation clause in that state constitution and pitch it back to the individual states. We simply say this, that all faith is free. If it is not free, it is not faith. There is no such thing as a coerced faith. We quote the Constitution, yes, the United States Constitution: this government shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, nor prohibit the free exercise thereof. But we quote Holy Scripture, that the nature of faith is voluntary. If it's not, it's coerced, and there's no such thing as a coerced religious faith. So I don't want my tax dollars supporting religious views I don't agree with. And I always use the example, Diane. Now I'm going to say this briefly, Carol, where we can get to these great questions. But I always say, with a twinkle in my eye and a smile on my face, look, I'm a Baptist. I don't believe in the infallibility of the Pope. I don't believe in the veneration of Mary. I don't want my tax dollars supporting those teachings in Catholic parochial schools, and then I give it a good long pause, any more than my Catholic friends want their tax dollars supporting a Baptist doctrine called the priesthood of all believers, because Catholic folks don't hold to that. And everybody kind of relaxes, and the room, breaks out and chuckle at that point. But it's still, look, religious liberty and church-state separation has served this country for a long, long time. Let's don't be throwing in the towel on that now. It's only the principle upon which our nation was built. And so we do broker that principle. It is powerful. It is. I'm glad you remembered it, because that really has been our contribution to the conversation about vouchers. And the legislators don't have any answer to it. And they have to say, Pastor, we're with you on that. And we've changed some minds. We have a coalition down here, the Coalition for Public Schools, that is comprised of all the teacher groups and all the administrator groups and community groups and even some religious groups. And as I say, there's going to be those insidious little voucher proposals and schemes cropping up like weeds. You're going to have those, but I think we're going to nip that in the bud. I do think this charter policy, and Carol, I'll take a breath here, I do think that's going to be tougher for all the reasons that we've just outlined in this conversation. So eat your Wheaties, everybody. we got our work cut out for us.
And with that, I'd like to introduce Marla Kilfoyle, our grassroots coordinator for Network for Public Education. And she has a lot of questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, but we'll do our best. Marla?
Thank you, Carol. Good evening, everybody. Yes, we do have a lot of questions, and our first one is from Lewis. And Lewis is asking Diane, what about the bright spots that we're seeing right now around public education during the COVID-19 pandemic? Community schools serve students and families. Can you talk a little bit about some of those great stories you've heard about public schools helping their communities during the COVID crisis?
Well, I've written, I feel during this period of the pandemic, I feel deeply unproductive. And the only thing I've been able to do is to write articles. And I have written a couple. I had one that just came out in Education Week, in which I argued that the pandemic has taught us the value of public schools, and that people are rallying around the public schools. They expect them to take care of the kids even though they're not there. They're relying on the teachers to come up with the lessons. They know that the schools are responsible for making sure that kids have access to the internet, that they have computers. A lot of kids don't, and a lot of the inequities have been revealed. But people have a brand new appreciation for real teachers. And it's my view, I could be wrong, but I don't think so, that when this is over, and I hope it's sooner rather than later, that parents are going to be thrilled to have their public schools reopen. They're not longing to homeschool. They're not longing to have a permanent distance learning. If anything, what I hear over and over again on social media and from every survey that I've seen in the media, parents understand they're not teachers. Most people have their own work, their own jobs, and they can't wait for their kids to get back to public school. So my view is that while there's nothing good about the pandemic, one of the things that will come out of it is a renewed appreciation for the importance of public schooling, and that we all have to show our appreciation to teachers, and the teachers are just working themselves to pieces. And I love the teacher parades where the teachers get in their cars and drive around the neighborhoods in those cities where there are neighborhoods, and show the children that they miss them, and the children certainly miss them. But I think that the upshot of all of this is going to be a renewed appreciation for the importance and value of public schools.
Great, thank you, Diane. Charlie, I'm going to weave two questions together because they're kind of the same thing. The first question is from Ann Dar, and Ann has been an educator for 31 years, and she's currently a trustee on the school board of a large urban school in Texas. And so her question is, as a trustee, how can she best stop the privatization of public schools? And then Sharon Kirsch, she's given a big shout out from Arizona, where 34 amazing Arizona public education advocates are watching this conversation. But she would also like to ask you, Charlie, could you talk also about the most compelling or effective tactic that you have used to stop vouchers? So that's kind of the same question. The best way to stop privatization, and weave into that the best tactic you guys have used to stop vouchers.
That's great, Marla. And I know Ann and Sharon both, and they're wonderful public education advocates, and I appreciate the question. I think you sit down, you have to form a relationship with a legislator. And sometimes that takes multiple visits and multiple conversations, a lot of hard work, it's a lot of shoe leather. Best done in the home community, by the way, not in the Capitol. Look, they get down to the Capitol, and we have enormous respect for these public servants. They don't make any money, and it's a lot of hard work, but there's a lot of prancing around that Capitol. There's a lot of self-importance and, to see and be seen, and a lot of inflated egos. Sit down with that House member in your community. So that's very important. Form a relationship, get to know his personal life, his family life. A pastor, a minister can more instinctively, this is awkward and uncomfortable for some folks, and it's maybe a cultural thing down here in Texas. You know, we say, Representative, how can we pray for you? How can we pray for your family? That goes a long way. I think that has been our unique contribution. It is a role of the minister as a vanguard for what we call God's common good. And Diane's already said it twice in this conversation. Representative, that $4,000 voucher won't even begin to pay for a quality education. Even in Texas, it takes $12,000 minimum to educate a child. So that voucher is only going to prop up inadequate, substandard voucher schools. You know that, and I know it. How can we help you say no to the American Legislative Exchange Council? How can we help you say no to the Betsy DeVos folks coming in? What's the name of her organization, Diane?
American Federation for Children.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. American Federation for Children.
And they have plenty of money.
Oh, they got all the money in the world. And then, you know, sometimes the conversation gets a little tough. We have to say, well, Representative, we're going to go to everybody in your district, and we're going to tell them that you voted for a policy that diverts money from the neighborhood public schools to prop up these bad charter schools, these bad voucher schools. Do you want us to do that? So there's a little thread in there. Again, I hit that note of, hey, it's democracy, Marla.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you remind that legislator that the voters are in charge and he's not. And it's her job to serve the public. That's what that legislator swore before God down here in Texas, placing his hand on a family Bible to uphold the Constitution of the great state of Texas that calls for free public schools. And we're going to go tell everybody in your district that you're breaking that vow. And, you know, they don't like that, but we have, as Carol said, 2,500 in our network. My goodness gracious, y'all. I bet we have 50,000 pastors in Texas. We hadn't scratched the surface. And so what we're trying to do, Marla, is create a culture change where we bring the church in cooperation and collaboration with the school, all in deference of the American doctrine of church-state separation, which is the corollary of God's gift of religious liberty. And I think that is the best thing that we can do to fight privatization. I think the best thing you can do is go get a bunch of preachers where you live and go sit down with them. Ministers want to make a difference in the world. Rabbis didn't go into the rabbinate in order to have their nose in Torah all day long. They wanted to change the world. That's why we go into this work. And let's go tap into that, and let's form what we call a preacher-teacher duo and get these advocacy, duets going all over the city and all over the state.
I want to offer one other suggestion in addition to what Charlie said. Mine, I don't know, it's more difficult or less difficult than what he's proposing. And that is, bear in mind that whenever there has been a state referendum on vouchers, in every state where it's come up, it has gone down overwhelmingly. And I want to give a shout out to SOS Arizona, because it's a very conservative state. It has a Governor, Doug Ducey, who was elected by the Koch brothers and the DeVos family, and a legislature that's very red. And yet they managed to get vouchers on the ballot in 2018, and they went down 65-35. The previous voucher ballot was in Florida, where it went down 55-45. And the only reason it was close was because Jeb Bush called it a religious freedom amendment, which was a total lie. It was all about vouchers. And before that, there was a vote in Utah, again, a red state, where it was 2/3 of the vote went against vouchers. And the same thing has been true of charters. There were referenda on charters in Georgia and in Mississippi, and Georgia and Massachusetts in 2016. Both of them overwhelmingly supported public schools. So to the extent that it's possible to organize a state referendum on public schools should get the public money and not religious schools, and no expansion of charters, get it on the ballot because you're going to win.
Thanks, Diane. All right, we have, and Diane, while we have you on the mic, this question I'm going to direct towards you because of your vast experience up at the federal level as the Assistant Secretary of Education. What do you think the U.S. Department of Education will try to implement to further push the privatization movement due to COVID? This is from Christy Hassett.
Well, I think that Betsy DeVos looks for every opportunity to promote the money follows the child, which is her way of saying that wherever the child goes, the money goes, and therefore the public schools deserve nothing unless people choose them. And it's her way of pushing the choice agenda. And I think that we're going to have an election in November, and my hope is that Betsy DeVos will not be with us beyond this, January 20th of next year, if she stays that long. But we just have to continue pushing back because she has advanced so many policies that not only hurt public schools, but hurt students, hurt teachers, hurt communities, hurt families, hurt college students who she fights every opportunity to relieve students of student debt from fraudulent colleges. So it's hard to know where to start with her. But we have to watch her carefully, because during this crisis, she will use it to strip IDA rights from children with disabilities. And there are petitions right now saying save IDEA. So much is going on behind the scenes, and we have to keep our eyes wide open and be prepared to do whatever political activity we can to protect children against her. She's really doesn't seem to have, I don't know where she sees her best interest, but it lies with Alec, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and with a very deep belief that the public schools are somehow don't deserve to exist.
Thank you, Diane. This one is from Mark Terry, and I'm going to let either of you answer this because, again, it has to do with the health crisis. Rumor is, given the present health crisis, that there will be a huge push to pass voucher legislation for online education, even as we know with its abysmal record. What are either of you hearing about this?
Well, let me just say that we do have a lot of research about online education, and it's important always to stick to evidence. And the evidence is that children get bored, children lack motivation, and that the quality of online education is very, very, very poor. In virtually every state that I'm aware of that has a virtual charter school that is engaged in distance learning, they are the worst school in the state, and they're very hard to close because they are where they are because of making political contributions and having ties to legislators who protect them. But in terms of educational quality, they are the absolute worst. And even the people in the charter community periodically will acknowledge this. The most important piece of research on this was done by the Walton-funded Credo at Stanford University at Hoover Institution, in which they said that going to a virtual charter school had the effect of causing children to lose 44 days in reading and 180 days in math in a school year of 180 days. That means they don't learn anything at all in math, and they lose ground in reading. I don't know that there's any way to turn that into an argument for vouchers for distance learning, unless you just say, well, kids shouldn't go to school. They should just pass the money on to some entrepreneur.
Education is so much more than intellectual, as everybody on the call knows. Mark, I appreciate your question. Mark's a great advocate down here in Texas and a public school educator of great accomplishment. And in his retirement, he is advocating for public schools in a wonderful organization of elementary principals and administrators. So much more happens. There's character building, there's mentoring. Diane, I gave an address following you and Carol in previous years to the Horace Mann League out in San Diego at the American Association of School Administrators annual meeting, and talked about Aristotle's view of moral development, which is that you practice, you follow a routine of behavior that has been modeled for you, and you do it again, and you do it again, and you do it again. Look, you can't do that on a computer. You can't do that virtually. And that's a misnomer anyway. I don't know why we call it virtual anything. It's not virtual. It's abstracted. And it's a tool that we have. We posted something on social media yesterday that, you know, a computer can no more educate a child without a teacher than a hammer can build a house without a carpenter. And so, you know, I think what we're gonna see is a lot of parents and professionals, everybody, including everybody on this call. We're doing our work through these Zoom calls now. Well, my God, we're exhausted at the end of the day. Our eyes are burning, and, you know, we're just sort of lobotomized by this screen. I think it's the time for us to double down again on the moral value of face-to-face incarnational instruction, where you have a dedicated teacher that is modeling, that is instilling the discipline of learning with children, that children look up to, that children emulate, that want to mimic. How does a child become a decent human being? Because he's had it modeled for him. She's had it modeled for her by her parents and by her classroom teachers. Is it a tool? Well, yes, it can be a tool, particularly, it seems to us as ministers on the upper grade levels, but it surely can never replace the role of that hands-on, affirming, that twinkle in the eye, that pat on the back. My goodness, that's what we live for.
I not only want to agree with you, Charles, but I have to mention a story many years ago. Back it was like 1984. Forbes magazine had a cover story called "The Coming Revolution in Education," in which the whole magazine was devoted to the idea that computers would take the place of schools. And for some reason, the technology editor of the magazine did not agree with the premise of the entire issue. And he wrote an editorial, and he said, if the computer becomes the main source of teaching, we will have a future in which the rich kids have teachers and the poor kids have computers. And I think that's where, I don't think it's where we're heading, because I think that what we've learned from this pandemic is there's no substitute for face-to-face interaction. I mean, people are social animals, and we don't learn alone. It's good to read a book alone. It's good to write alone. But in terms of being in a classroom, you want to have discussion, you want to have debate, you want to have exchange with your peers, as well as have the teacher who gives you the encouragement, the support, the, you know, saying that's not good enough, you can do better. And you cannot get that through a computer.
No.
No. And we have one more question for the both of you. And you touched a little bit of both of you have touched a bit upon this in terms of foundations that have oodles and oodles of money that are able to sort of fund what, you know, Diane calls the disruptors in slaying Goliath. Christy Hassett asks, is there any group that's considering creating public education friendly versions of Alec, where we write bills that support public education? Diane, what do you think about that?
I think it's a great idea, but it takes a lot of money. The reason that Alec has been so powerful is, first of all, they have enormous corporate support There's a book written by Gordon Laffer, Lafer, called The 1% Solution, in which he goes into great detail about Alec, and he explains how he gives a list of the names of the corporations that support Alec, and they give them 25,000 or more each. And then they have 2,000 legislators who belong to Alec, and they come to these meetings in very posh resorts where all expenses are paid. And it's because they have so much money behind them that they're able to push out these bills and have these compliant legislators. And I just don't, right now, I don't see that kind of money available. People, people who are part of this disruption movement say, oh, you are the status quo. And I always push back and say, no, you guys are the status quo. You've owned federal policy for 20 years. You've got all these major philanthropists backing you. You have an unlimited source of money with the Waltons and Eli Broad and Bill Gates and John Arnold from Texas, and on with all these billionaires supporting whatever they do. And we don't have that kind of money. What we have is we have masses of people, which is why our greatest strength, I believe, lies not in trying to create another Alec, but rather in activism by parents, by teachers, by everybody who cares about maintaining it and strengthening their public school system. And they have the money, we have the numbers, and we have to understand that there is tremendous power in numbers.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we win referenda. And
Yes.
we've won every referenda there's ever been on that determines the future of public education. We have to use our numbers and not go looking for billionaires, because whereas every once in a while there's one or two, maybe a couple. I know there's Charles Butt in Texas. There's a couple of others that I can think of. But they're not pumping out hundreds of millions of dollars every year the way the Waltons and the other philanthropists are. So what I hope to do, what I tried to do through Slaying Goliath, was to say to the billionaires, if some of them read this book, fellows, you have lost. It's over. You are pumping good money after bad, or bad money after good, and it's just a waste of money. You keep supporting charters, and the charters close almost as fast as they open.
Mm-hmm.
Vouchers have a horrible record. Support your public schools. And the good news is that before all this terrible health crisis started, Ed Week had an article saying that K-12, that philanthropists these days, other than the big boys, the philanthropists are increasingly turning away from K-12 reform, meaning the DeVos, Gates, Broad agenda, the Walton agenda. They're turning away from that because they see there are no results. And so instead of supporting standards, testing, and accountability and charters and vouchers, they're supporting education in the arts, education and mental health, education and the school to prison pipeline. These are very good things for philanthropists to support instead of trying to reinvent the school. So I think there are some very hopeful signs. And the most important thing I wanted to accomplish was to get across to the philanthropists, do positive things, stop attacking the public schools, do good things that actually help children and help families and help communities.
Diane, I want to just say a big old amen to that. It's a very positive and accurate comment. We find the foundations to be wonderful organizations, and these directors are high quality people who want and do great good, want to do and do accomplish great good in society. They are good stewards of their money. That's why it's so mystifying, why they keep throwing good money after, what's the phrase? Good money after bad, or bad money after good. They keep wasting this funding on educational models that don't work. I think we're seeing a tipping point, and the pendulum swinging back now. And let's just pray that gains momentum.
And Charlie, can we perhaps close have you ask or talk a little bit about the pastor network? Because I know we have so many wonderful pastor networks. We have pastors for Oklahoma children, pastors for Florida children, pastors for Tennessee children, pastors for North Carolina children. Can you just share with the viewers very quickly a little bit about the pastor network?
Sure, thank you, and thank you so much, all of you, for allowing us to share about our mission. Well, as we've said in this conversation, that education is such an intensely, profoundly human enterprise that has a core spiritual dimension to it. And ministers and faith leaders instinctively recognize that. So when we can come into a state and begin to have meetings, generally at the invitation of school people, that's how it starts, is a school leader, a superintendent, or a principal, or sometimes a classroom teacher just convenes a small number of clergy, and we come in and present our mission. We've got those people enlisted, and we put them into our communications network and begin to orient them and educate them and enlighten them about all these issues that we have discussed in this call, and they become convicted. Let me tell you, when you get a minister who's convicted, you've got something very, very powerful. Now, it's tough in some places, Indiana and Arizona and Florida. These are very difficult places, frankly, much more difficult, it seems to me, by my limited perspective, than Texas. And the going is slow. But as you say, Marla, we're now in 8 states. Alabama is our most recent state. And it just simply means that there are 2 things. There are 2 things we have to have in order to plant an affiliate or a cohort in a state. We have to have the right, committed, informed, and convicted faith leader. Okay. And that's almost always an ordained clergy person. Amy Frog, who is featured in Diane's book, who's so completely wonderful, is our leader in Tennessee and doing a marvelous job as a layperson. The rest of our leaders are ordained clergy. And secondly, about a couple of dozen ministers. Doesn't have to be 100, doesn't have to be 200. You start with a small group of people. And what's that wonderful quote by Margaret Mead that, a small group of people can change the world. In fact, that's the only thing that's ever changed it. I'm paraphrasing there. Wish I could remember the wonderful flourish of that quote, but that's it. And so it's not always easy. And there are some places where ministers are a little more frightened and a little more cautious, and it takes longer. So in God's good time, but we'd like to be in all 50 states, and it, as has been said, it's a labor-intensive organizational project. Doesn't require a lot of money. It does require a lot of conviction.
And you guys have done an amazing job, and we look forward to seeing the future of that. Diane, we're going to ask you to close with the question from the amazing Houston, Texas teacher, Daniel Santos, is sending in a question. And he says that Houston, which is where you graduated from, Diane, is the largest school district in danger of losing its elected board of trustees. Would you share your thoughts or words of wisdom to inspire us activists in our battle against the disruptors?
Daniel, I've followed your tweets on Twitter. I'm well aware of your fight in Houston. And I think that what's happening in terms of the State Department of Education and the legislature is an outrage. As I understand it, the law says that if there's one failing school, they can take over the whole district. And of course, the one school is Wheatley, which is not a failing school. It's a school that's overloaded with kids with disabilities, overloaded with kids who are in poverty, overloaded with kids who don't speak English, which is typical of schools that get labeled failing but are not failing. And the idea that the state somehow is wiser than your elected board of trustees is ridiculous. I refer you to a book that I'm sure you're well aware of. It's called Takeover. The author is Domingo Morel. And what Domingo Morel has said is that takeover is not about education. It's about politics, race, and power. It's about, in this case in Texas, taking power away from a board dominated by Black and Hispanic elected officials and taking away from them that stair step that will allow them to enter politics, to run for Congress, to run for state senator, to run for state representative, and to disempower the whole community by taking away that traditional ladder. There has never been, to my knowledge, a takeover that has led to better education. It's simply a matter of powerful people flexing their muscles and showing that they can do to a community what should never be done, which is to strip away its democracy. So I would urge you to fight on and fight for your democratic rights and fight for the right of the people of Houston to select their own school board and not to be ruled by the bureaucrats and politicians in Austin.
And on that note, I think what we'll do is we'll say goodnight to everyone. And thank you so much, Diane and Charles, for spending this wonderful hour and a half with us this evening. Darcy has been recording this session, and we are going to have it tomorrow. We'll have a link up on our website, and Marla will be putting it out on social media. And we thank everybody for joining us. And we all hope that you stay well and safe, and hopefully we will be able to see each other in person shortly. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.